The great hall of the alien kingdom was dimly lit by the glow of strange crystal lamps. The air was thick with tension, and the weight of the decision in the room seemed to press down on everyone present. King Varen, ruler of the Raxian Empire, sat upon his throne, his cold eyes scanning the gathered council members. His massive, armored figure was a symbol of strength, his every movement precise and calculated. Yet today, his expression was far from the usual calm. It was a face filled with concern. Before him stood his only daughter, Princess Salora. Unlike her father, who towered with power, Salora seemed frail in comparison. She had always been considered weak, delicate even by Raxian standards. At only 18 years old, she had never displayed the strength that was expected of someone of royal blood. Her slender frame and lack of combat ability had made her the subject of whispered criticism throughout the Empire. The warrior culture of the Raxians placed great value on strength and fighting prowess, and Salora had none of it. Despite her position, Salora had always felt like an outsider in her own home. Her father's expectations weighed heavily on her, and the kingdom's warriors mocked her for her inability to hold a sword or participate in the grand battles that had earned the Raxians their fearsome reputation. King Varen, ever the strategic ruler, had long feared that his daughter's weakness would bring shame to the Empire. His enemies would use her to undermine his reign, and they already whispered about her future. "Father, please," Salora's voice trembled as she addressed the king, her eyes filled with desperation. "I can still be of use to you." Baron raised his hand to silence her. His voice was low but firm, filled with a cold authority that commanded attention. "Salora, you are my only child, and yet you have proven yourself unfit to rule this empire. You lack the strength that every ruler of Raxia must possess. I cannot leave the empire to someone who will be seen as weak." The council members murmured among themselves, some nodding in agreement. Salora felt the sting of their words, but she held her head high, determined to keep her composure. She had spent years trying to gain her father's approval, but it always seemed out of reach. Still, she couldn't give up on him now. She was his daughter, after all. Her father's next words cut through the air, final and harsh. "You will be married, Salora, to a human warrior, a soldier who will provide the strength you lack. This will be your path to power, for the good of our kingdom." A shockwave of disbelief struck Salora's heart. A human? She had heard of humans, foreigners from a distant planet, who were known for their strength and brutal combat. But why would her father want her to marry one? Was he truly willing to give her away in exchange for an alliance? Salora could barely speak. Her mind raced, but the words wouldn't come. But why? Why a human? She finally asked, her voice shaky but determined. King Varen's gaze softened, but only slightly. "They are warriors, Salora. Their strength is unmatched, and they are adaptable. With their bloodline mixed with ours, you will be able to inherit their power, their skill. The alliance with their people will also strengthen our empire. The humans are our allies in this war with the Zalor Empire." Salora looked around the room at the council members, each one with an expression of either approval or indifference. She felt alone in the center of it all. No one seemed to question her father's decision. It was final. The king had made up his mind. She would marry a human soldier, and in doing so, she would fulfill her duty to the Raxian Empire. The idea filled her with a mixture of fear and uncertainty. She had never met a human before, and the thought of marrying one, a stranger, was terrifying. But her father's will was not to be questioned. She would go through with it, just as she had always done with her father's demands. But deep inside, Salora couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She had no choice but to accept her fate. As the council meeting concluded, Salora was escorted from the hall by the royal guards. Her mind was spinning with thoughts of the future, and her heart ached with the knowledge that her life was about to change in ways she could not yet comprehend. Later that evening, in the royal gardens, Salora found herself alone. The moonlight, bathed the flowers in a soft glow, and the sweet scent of alien blossoms filled the air. Silora had always found solace in the quiet beauty of the gardens, but tonight she felt a great emptiness. Her future felt uncertain, and her father's decision weighed heavily on her heart. She stood in front of a fountain, staring at the water as it rippled with the breeze. The princess had always dreamed of being strong, of earning her father's respect and love, but she had never been given the chance to prove herself. She had been treated like a delicate flower, unable to withstand the pressures of the world. "Why can't I be more like him?" she whispered to the night sky, her voice barely audible. "Why am I not strong like the other Raxians?" As if in response, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was Kale, the human soldier whom her father had chosen for her. His presence was imposing, tall, muscular, and exuding an aura of strength that seemed to contrast with her own fragile appearance. Silora had heard rumors about him, tales of his skill on the battlefield and his fearlessness in combat. The human was a legend among the Raxians, and now he stood before her. Kyle's eyes, sharp and calculating, met hers. "Your father spoke to me," he said, his voice deep and steady. "It seems we are to be married." Silora's heart raced. "Yes," she replied, trying to hide the tremor in her voice. "It seems so." Kyle took a step forward, his gaze never leaving hers. "I've heard much about you, princess. I won't pretend to understand the ways of your people, but I know what it means to fight to survive, and I know what it takes to become strong." Silora felt a spark of something in his words, something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, this human could help her become the warrior her father demanded. Maybe, with his guidance, she could finally find the strength she had always longed for. "I will do what is required of me," Silora said, her voice steady now. "But I will also fight for my own strength." Kale nodded. "I can help you with that, but you'll have to want it, you'll have to fight for it, to fight for." The princess looked up at the moon once more, the weight of her decision heavy in her heart. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in her life, she felt the fire of determination stirring within her. Perhaps this strange union with the human warrior would be her chance to finally become the woman her father could be proud of. Perhaps it would be her chance to prove that she could be more than just a weak princess. The sun had barely risen when Silora found herself standing in the palace courtyard, staring at the wooden training dummies that lined the far side of the field. Kyle stood beside her, his eyes scanning the area with a focus that made her feel small in comparison. He was a human warrior, a battle-hardened soldier, and his presence was enough to make Silora feel like she had been dropped into a world she didn't understand. For a moment she hesitated. The weight of her father's decision still sat heavily on her shoulders. She had always been the delicate princess, the one who couldn't fight, couldn't wield a sword. Now, she was being asked to transform into someone else entirely. Someone strong, someone capable of leading armies. How could she possibly become that person? Kale broke her thoughts with a low voice filled with quiet authority. "If you want to be more than a princess, Silora, you have to train like one of us. No excuses, no room for weakness." Silora nodded, swallowing the nervous lump in her throat. She had no choice. This was her path now. She was no longer just the king's daughter. She was a warrior's wife, soon to be a leader. She couldn't afford to fail. She glanced at Kale, who was already moving toward the training dummies with swift, confident steps. "I'm ready," she said, though the words didn't come easily. Kale gave her a brief look, his face hard as stone. "Then show me." For the next several days, Silora's life revolved around grueling training. Kale's methods were harsh, designed to break down everything she thought she knew about fighting and build her up again from the ground up. Every morning began with a run through the palace grounds, followed by hours of practice with a sword, learning to swing it with precision and power. But it wasn't just about the sword. It was about learning to read the battlefield, to understand the ebb and flow of combat, to react without thinking. At first, Silora could barely lift the weight of the sword, let alone swing it with any force. Her arms ached, her muscles screamed, in protest, but Kale would not let her stop. He was relentless, and every time she faltered, he pushed her harder. "You can do better," he would say, never offering any praise, only a quiet demand for more. It was as though he didn't see her as a princess, but as a fellow soldier, a fellow warrior. But the days went by, and something began to change. By the end of the first week, Selora was no longer stumbling through her movements. Her hands were steady as she gripped the sword's hilt, and the training dummies, once so much taller and intimidating, no longer seemed like impossible obstacles. She could slice through them with more precision now, and each swing felt more natural. The rhythm of battle was slowly becoming second nature to her, yet it was not just her physical training that had changed. Kyle was teaching her to think like a warrior. He didn't just show her how to fight, he showed her why. The days in the training camp were growing longer, and Selora's confidence had begun to grow with them. She had faced numerous opponents, each battle leaving her more skilled than before. But nothing had prepared her for the challenge she would face today. The real war was no longer just about learning how to fight. It was about becoming the kind of leader her people needed. And the first test would come sooner than she expected. Kale, ever the stoic instructor, had led her to the edge of the camp, one evening. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the training field. He was silent as always, but Selora knew that tonight was different. He had brought her here for a reason. She could feel the air around her shift, the familiar stillness of the camp now charged with anticipation. "Tonight," Kale said, his voice low, "you will face the ultimate test. There will be no mock battles, no dummies to fight. You will face real warriors, soldiers trained for war." Selora swallowed. She had heard of these warriors before, the Raxian elite, the ones who fought at the king's side. They were feared across the galaxy, and now she was being asked to fight them. The thought sent a tremor of doubt through her, but she quickly pushed it aside. This was her moment. She had worked for this, trained for this. She couldn't back down now. The moonlight glinted off the metal armor of the soldiers who had gathered around the field, their eyes fixed on her as they waited for her to take her place. They had heard of her skills in battle, and though some of them respected her, many were eager to see if the princess had truly become a warrior, or if it had all been a fluke. They didn't believe she could win. As Selora stood there, facing them, she felt a weight on her shoulders. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for the future of her kingdom. Her father had given her this chance, but now she had to prove to him and to herself that she was worthy. Kale stood nearby, his arms crossed, watching her closely. "Remember everything I've taught you," he said, his tone firm. "Control your fear. Focus. This is no longer about winning. It's about proving that you belong here." Selora nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She took a deep breath, feeling the cool night air fill her lungs. Then she stepped onto the battlefield, sword in hand. The soldiers slowly began to form a circle around her, their faces stern, their weapons ready. Each one was a seasoned fighter. They would not hold back. The leader of the group, a tall soldier named Raxan, stepped forward. He was a veteran, known for his unmatched strength and battle strategy. His eyes narrowed as he sized Selora up, his expression one of amusement. "Let's see what you've learned, princess," he said, his voice mocking. Without waiting for a response, he charged at her, his sword raised high. The speed at which he moved caught Selora off guard. He wasn't wasting any time. She barely had a moment to react as he swung his sword down toward her. Instinctively, Selora raised her own blade, blocking the strike with all her might. The force of the blow nearly knocked her to the ground, but she stood firm, her legs shaking but not giving way. Raxan grinned, clearly impressed by her ability to hold her ground. He quickly followed up with another attack, this time aiming for her side. Selora moved just in time to dodge, the tip of his blade grazing her armor. The close call sent a jolt of adrenaline through her. She could feel her heart racing, the battle instincts kicking in as she focused on her opponent. For the next few minutes, Raxan pressed his attack, his strikes coming fast and furious. Selora found herself on the defensive, blocking and dodging, as best as she could. She wasn't yet as skilled as him, but she was learning quickly. With every movement, she grew more aware of the battlefield. She could see his patterns, his weaknesses, and she knew that, if given the right moment, she could turn the tide. As Raxan swung his sword once more, Selora saw an opening. She shifted, her weight, using her agility to move around him. With a quick, well-placed strike, she knocked his sword out of his hand, sending it clattering to the ground. The soldiers gasped, and for a moment there was silence. Raxan's eyes widened in disbelief as he stared at Selora. He wasn't finished, though. Without hesitation, he grabbed another sword from a nearby soldier and came at her again, this time with even more fury. But Selora was ready. She used the momentum of his charge to her advantage, ducking under his swing and delivering a sharp blow to his side. This time the strike landed with precision, knocking him back. Raxan stumbled, clearly surprised by the force of her attack. But he quickly regained his balance, and Selora could see the respect in his eyes. He wasn't expecting this from her, and it was clear he hadn't expected to be outsmarted. Kyle, watching from the edge of the field, allowed himself a rare smile. She's not just surviving. She's learning. She's becoming a warrior. Raxan, though still stunned, didn't back down. He came at her again, this time with renewed determination. But Selora was no longer just reacting. She was anticipating, calculating each move with a calmness she hadn't known she was capable of. Her blade moved with fluid grace, striking, with precision, blocking and countering with newfound strength. The battle raged on, but now it was clear that Selora was no longer the inexperienced princess she had been when she first started. She was a warrior in her own right, holding her ground against some of the best fighters in the kingdom. Finally, after what felt like hours, Raxan lowered his sword in surrender. He was panting heavily, his armor battered, and his respect for Selora evident. "You've proven yourself, princess," he said, his voice sincere. "You are a true warrior." The soldiers around them erupted into applause, a mixture of admiration and disbelief on their faces. Selora stood, breathless but proud, as she took in the sight of the warriors who had once doubted her. She had done it. She had shown them all that she was no longer the weak, helpless princess they had once known. She was something more. She was a warrior. After the battle, Kale approached her, his expression unchanged, but there was a flicker of pride in his eyes. "You did well," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "You didn't just fight to win. You fought with strategy. You fought with purpose." Selora nodded, still catching her breath. "I couldn't have done it without you. You taught me everything." Kyle shook his head. "You learned it all on your own. I only showed you the way. It's your strength, your will, that carried you through." Selora smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. For the first time, she truly believed in herself. She had proven to the kingdom and to herself that she was more than just a princess. She was a force to be reckoned with. As the soldiers began to leave the field, murmuring amongst themselves about the battle they had witnessed, Kale stepped closer to her. "You've come a long way, Selora, but this is just the beginning. The war isn't over. You have to be ready for what comes next." Selora nodded, her gaze steady. She had come far, but she knew the hardest part was still ahead. She wasn't just fighting for her father's approval anymore. She was fighting for her people, for her future, and for the legacy she would one day leave behind. Cliffhanger. As Selora stood there looking over the battlefield, a shadow moved at the edge of the camp. A new threat was on the horizon, one that would test her in ways she couldn't yet imagine. But for now, she was ready. She was stronger than ever, and nothing would stop her from facing the challenges ahead. The air felt different that morning, heavy with an unspoken tension. The camp, which had always been filled with the sounds of soldiers training, now seemed quieter. There was a palpable sense of anticipation hanging in the air. Selora couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. Something far beyond. the mock battles and training exercises she had become accustomed to. Kale's instructions had been clear that morning. Today, we begin preparing for what lies ahead. For weeks now, Silora had trained relentlessly, facing opponent after opponent, each one tougher than the last. She had grown stronger, physically, mentally, and emotionally. Her father's words, which had once echoed in her mind as a constant reminder of her weakness, were fading into the background. She was no longer the fragile princess. She was becoming a warrior. But today she would face her greatest challenge yet. It was just after midday when the first hint of danger arrived. Silora stood by the training ground, wiping the sweat from her brow after a particularly exhausting sparring match with Kale. The sun beat down on her, but her focus was sharp. She had grown used to the heat and exhaustion. It was all part of the process. What surprised her was the sudden tension that seemed to fill the air. The soldiers who had been training nearby had grown silent, their eyes scanning the horizon as though they sensed something was amiss. "What's happening?" Silora asked, her voice steady but filled with curiosity. Kale, who had been watching the camp's perimeter closely, didn't immediately answer. He stood still for a moment, as if measuring the air itself, before he turned to her. "Stay close. To me, Silora," he said, his voice sharp with an edge she hadn't heard before. Before Silora could ask further questions, a shrill, unsettling whistle echoed from the trees on the far side of the camp. It was followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps crunching over the dry ground. The soldiers immediately fell into formation, their faces hardening with the same instinctual readiness that had made them so deadly in battle. "An attack?" Silora asked, her pulse quickie. The days that followed the assassin's attack were filled with preparation. Kyle and Silora worked together, strengthening their bond as both allies and equals. They spent countless hours in the training fields, refining Silora's skills and preparing for the challenges ahead. Yet beneath the surface of their training there was an ever-growing sense of urgency. The war that had been raging at the borders of the Raxian Empire was drawing closer to their home, and every day seemed to bring them nearer to a final confrontation. The sun rose on the morning of what would be their greatest challenge. The atmosphere in the camp was charged with energy. Soldiers moved with a sense of purpose, their weapons polished, their faces grim. There was no more time for training. Today they would march. Silora stood at the edge of the camp, watching as the army prepared for battle. The air was thick with the smell of leather and steel, and the distant rumble of war drums echoed in the background. She had never seen the kingdom's warriors so focused, so determined. They were all here for one reason: to defend the empire. And Silora, once just a fragile princess, was now part of that force. Kale stood beside her, his gaze fixed on the horizon, where dark clouds of smoke rose from the direction of the enemy's advance. "It's time," he said, his voice steady but carrying an underlying note of urgency. Silora nodded, her heart heavy, but her resolve unwavering. "I'm ready," she said, though she wasn't sure if she was talking about the battle or about herself. Both felt just as daunting. The army moved swiftly, the sound of their footsteps a unified, thunderous rhythm as they marched across the fields toward the front lines. The tension in the air was palpable. Silora, dressed in the armor of the Raxian warriors, felt every weight of expectation pressing down on her. This was her moment, the moment her father had promised her. She wasn't just a princess anymore. She was a leader, a warrior. As they neared the battlefield, the enemy forces came into view. The Zaylor Empire's army was vast, tens of thousands of soldiers, their dark armor and banners billowing in the wind. They were known for their brutal efficiency and their ruthless tactics. This would not be an easy fight. Kale, riding beside her, turned to her and said, "You've trained for this. Now you lead. You command your army with the strength and wisdom you've earned. Do not hesitate. Remember everything you've learned." Silora's mind raced. She had been training for months, but nothing could prepare her for the weight of the responsibility she now carried. The lives of thousands were in her hands. Her father, the king, had given her this chance to prove herself. He was counting on her to lead, just as the soldiers were counting on her to be their strength. She could feel the weight of their eyes upon her. They respected her now, but would they follow her when the time came? The thought made her stomach tighten, but she didn't allow it to show. She could not afford to show doubt, not now. The battle began with a deafening roar as the two armies collided, the sound of metal on metal ringing out across the field. Celora's soldiers charged forward, their swords raised high while the enemy pressed in from all sides, determined to break their lines. It was chaos, pure and simple. The battlefield became a blur of movement, a whirlwind of fighting and shouting. Celora was not unfamiliar with the chaos of war, but the scale of this battle was unlike anything she had seen before. She fought alongside the soldiers, her sword flashing as she cut through enemy lines. Her movements were swift, her strikes precise. She was no longer the princess who had hesitated in battle. She was a warrior, a leader, commanding her army with every strike, every decision. But it wasn't just the physical aspect of the battle that weighed on her. The strategy, the decisions she had to make, were just as crucial. As the battle raged, Celora found herself coordinating with her commanders, directing them to key positions, ensuring the lines held. She couldn't afford to let the enemy break through. Not now. Not after everything she had fought for. She fought her way through the enemy's ranks leading from the front, her blade flashing as she cut down one soldier after another. The power she had gained in her training was evident now. She was a force to be reckoned with, her mind sharp, her body strong. She was no longer afraid. Hours passed and the battle showed no sign of slowing. The soldiers on both sides were exhausted, their strength beginning to wane. But Celora pushed on, her resolve only growing stronger with every step. She knew that the moment they faltered, the enemy would overrun them. There was no time for hesitation. Kale, who had fought beside her the entire time, appeared at her side, again. "We're holding, but we need to push them back," he said, his voice urgent. "Take the center, Celora. Lead them straight through." Celora nodded without hesitation. She understood the plan. This was the moment that would decide the battle. They needed to break the enemy's line, to drive them back with everything they had. Raising her sword high, she turned to her soldiers. "Follow me," she shouted, her voice ringing out over the din of the battlefield, and with that, they charged. Fury. Clash of steel filled the air as Celora led her warriors into the heart of the enemy's formation. She fought with everything she had, her strength, her training, and her determination all focused on one goal: victory. Her sword cut through the enemy's defenses, her movements swift and precise. She was no longer just a figurehead. She was the embodiment of the Raxian spirit, a symbol of their strength and resolve. But the Zalor Empire was not an enemy to be taken lightly. Their soldiers fought fiercely, pushing back against Celora's charge with everything they had. The air was thick with the sound of combat, the ground beneath them stained with the blood of those who had already fallen. Celora's heart pounded in her chest as she fought, but she couldn't afford to stop. She couldn't afford to falter. The kingdom, her people, depended on her. She had to win. Then, as the battle seemed to reach its peak, a loud horn sounded from the Zalor lines. It was a call for reinforcements. Celora's heart sank. They had to end this quickly or their victory would slip away. "Kale," she called, her voice barely audible over the chaos. "We need to end this now." Kale, hearing her call, nodded sharply. "We'll push through the center, together." They moved in unison, their swords flashing as they broke through the enemy's lines. Celora fought with a fury she had never known, her sword cutting down Zalor soldiers with precision and power. The enemy's reinforcements were arriving, but they were too late. The Raxian forces, led by Celora, were unstoppable now. Hours later, as the dust began to settle and the sounds of battle faded, the field was littered with the fallen. Celora stood, breathing heavily, her sword dripping with blood. The battle had been hard fought, but they had won. The enemy had been pushed back, their forces shattered, But the cost had been great. The battlefield was littered with bodies, both Raxian and Zalor. Silora's heart was heavy with the weight of their loss. She had led them to victory, but it had come at a price. Kale approached her, his face covered in dirt and sweat, but there was a look of pride in his eyes. "You did it," he said, his voice hoarse from the battle. "You led them." Silora nodded, but the pride she should have felt was overshadowed by the loss. "We've won today," she said softly, "but the war is far from over." Kyle's gaze softened. "Yes, but today you showed them who you are. You are no longer just the princess, you are a leader." Silora looked out over the battlefield, her mind focused on the future. She had proven herself, but this was just the beginning. The war would continue, and there would be more battles to fight. But she was ready. She had to be. Cliffhanger. As the Raxian soldiers celebrated their hard-earned victory, a messenger arrived with urgent news. The enemy's most powerful general was marching toward the capital. The war was far from over, and Silora would have to lead her army into an even greater battle. The days after the battle had been a blur for Silora. Her victory had been celebrated by her soldiers, but she could not shake the weight of the lives lost during the fight. The cost of war was always steep, and though they had won the battle, the war was far from over. As Silora stood on the balcony of the palace overlooking the courtyard below, she couldn't help but feel the enormity of her role. She was no longer just the princess. She was the leader of her people, the one they looked to for guidance and strength. The realization still felt strange, but it was a responsibility she had grown to accept, one she would never back away from. Beside her, Kyle stood silently, his gaze directed outward as well. His presence had become a constant in her life, not just as a warrior, but as someone she trusted more than anyone else. His guidance had been invaluable, and though their relationship had started out as one of duty, it had deepened into something much stronger. They had been through so much together, and now, with the weight of the war still pressing on them, they both knew that their journey was far from finished. "Kyle," Silora said softly, breaking the silence, "do you think we can win this war?" Kale turned to her, his expression serious. "We can win, Silora. But it won't be easy. The Zalor Empire is powerful, and their general is not someone to be underestimated. We'll need to be stronger than ever." Silora nodded. She had seen the strength of the Zalor forces firsthand, and she knew that their general, an infamous strategist named General Vorn, was a formidable enemy. The rumors surrounding him spoke of his cunning,